The man lies back in the grass, eyes fixed on a drifting summer sky. He's not thinking much, just watching clouds. But then a face emerges. A real, detailed human face with a crooked smile, and for a moment it feels like the sky is speaking. To him, a few blocks away, a woman fiddles with the dial on an old radio. It's tuned between stations, producing a low hiss of white noise. Then suddenly, she hears something. Her mother's voice. Clear as day. Her mother died years ago. In a casino across the ocean, a gambler stares at the roulette wheel. Red, black, red, black, red. It's obvious to him now. The next spin has to be black. It has to be. What's happening in these moments? These aren't random quirks of the imagination. These are examples of something much deeper, something universal. A kind of instinct that all of us carry, often without realizing it. The relentless search for patterns. It's one of the brain's most fundamental powers. Pattern recognition is how we make sense of the world. It's what allows us to learn languages, anticipate danger, recognize faces, and hear rhythm in music. It's how we solved the mysteries of the planets and discovered the hidden rules of numbers. Without it, civilization wouldn't exist. And yet this same superpower can betray us. It convinces gamblers they're on a winning streak when they're not. It leads people to believe in signs and omens that don't exist. It can make us think we're being watched, followed, or chosen. It feeds into conspiracy theories, mass delusions, and hallucinations. So here's the uncomfortable question. If pattern recognition is the brain's way of making sense of reality, how often does it lead us astray? In the 1950s, a group of psychologists ran a strange experiment. Volunteers were asked to stare at a blank screen filled with nothing but static random white dots. Like the fuzz on an old television, there was no image, no meaning, no message, and yet almost all of them began to see something. Faces, shapes, movements, whole scenes. The brain, starved for structure, started inventing it. This wasn't a glitch. This was a feature. When the world offers nothing but noise, the mind doesn't just give up. It fights back. It conjures meaning out of randomness. It creates a pattern even if one doesn't exist. Because for most of human history, missing a pattern was more dangerous than inventing one. A rustle in the bushes might be the wind, or it might be a predator. Our brains evolved to assume the latter. Better to be wrong and alive than right and dead. And so we became creatures who find stories in clouds, messages in noise, and fate in chance. But now we live in a world overflowing with information, more patterns than ever before, real and imagined. So the question becomes, has our brain's gift turned into a liability? This story begins with that question. It's a journey into the architecture of perception, the biology of belief, and the fine line between insight and illusion. Why does your brain crave patterns, then, when they're not real? And what does that say about the nature of reality itself? Even when you're doing nothing, no phone, no conversation, no conscious thought, your brain is far from silent. It hums along. In a kind of low-power mode, still burning energy, still active. Neuroscientists call this the default mode network, or DMN. It's a sprawling system of brain regions that lights up when you're daydreaming, remembering the past, imagining the future, or simply sitting in silence. And one of its most curious behaviors is this. When you aren't actively focused on a task, your brain starts hunting for patterns. It pieces together fragments of memory, stitching meaning into randomness. In stillness, the mind becomes a storyteller. This habit isn't a flaw, it's a result of millions of years of evolutionary pressure. Pattern recognition was a survival skill long before it became a scientific principle. If your ancestors couldn't distinguish a snake from a stick, or notice when fruit ripened by the changing color of leaves, they didn't survive long enough to pass on their genes. The ability to see regularity in the natural world, like where the sun rises, when the rains return, or how animals migrate, was the beginning of prediction. And prediction was power. The earliest humans who could find order in chaos were more likely to eat, escape danger, and raise offspring. Nature didn't reward the most logical thinkers, rewarded the most pattern-sensitive. But today, that same mechanism works in a very different environment. Our world is no longer shaped by the movement of animals or the rhythm of the seasons, but by complex data flows, algorithms, media, and social information. Still, the brain clings to its ancient job description: find meaning, even when it isn't there. In fact, modern technologies have evolved to mimic this neural habit. Facial recognition software, for example, is built on models that simulate how the human brain identifies faces, a task we're so good at. We often see faces where none exist, in clouds, power outlets, or the surface of the moon. AI systems learn by detecting patterns across millions of data points, echoing the way neurons fire in sync when exposed to repetition. Music, too, activates our pattern machinery. Our brains light up when we hear predictable rhythms, but they respond even more intensely when those rhythms include subtle, unexpected shifts, just enough surprise to keep us engaged. But there's a darker side to this sensitivity. Some mental health conditions can be viewed through the lens of overactive or misaligned pattern processing. In obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, the brain may latch on to imagined threats or rituals, repeating behaviors in a desperate attempt to impose order. In schizophrenia, the mind can generate patterns where none exist at all, sometimes hearing voices or detecting hidden messages in everyday speech. And in autism, heightened attention to detail and patterns, sometimes at the expense of larger social cues, can dramatically shape perception and experience. Which raises a crucial question: what happens when a survival mechanism like pattern recognition, something built to help us, collides with the overwhelming chaos of modern life? When we're flooded by data, noise, and randomness, does our brain start to malfunction? Does it create patterns that aren't just false, but dangerous? In an era of conspiracy theories, deepfakes, and algorithmic manipulation, our gift for pattern seeking may no longer be just a tool, it may be a vulnerability. We've built a civilization around pattern recognition, but now we need to ask, who's controlling the patterns? And more urgently, can we still trust the patterns our brains insist on seeing? In a quiet lab filled with the hum of machines, a subject lies motionless inside the barrel of an fMRI scanner. On a screen in front of them, nothing but dots. Just random, scattered white points on a black background, pure visual noise. Number, image, no shape, no meaning. And yet, as the scanner records brain activity, something strange happens. Regions in the visual cortex flare up. Areas tied to object recognition, shape processing, even memory and emotion begin to activate. The brain is reacting as if it sees something, realigns, faces, perhaps even movement, despite the absence of any actual structure. The pattern isn't in the screen, it's in the brain. This is one of many studies that have revealed a startling truth. When the brain detects a pattern, It uses the same neural pathways, whether the pattern is real or imagined. The circuits don't differentiate. If you think you see a figure in the noise, the brain behaves as though it actually exists. In cognitive terms, perception and imagination overlap more than we'd like to believe. The implication is profound. The brain doesn't simply process reality, it constructs it. This discovery introduces a psychological dilemma. Faced with pure randomness, the human brain doesn't retreat into uncertainty. It reaches out, grabs onto whatever fragments it can find, and fills in the gaps. It's not comfortable with chaos. In fact, it resists it. Studies in psychology and neuroscience repeatedly show that people prefer a wrong answer to no answer at all. The discomfort of ambiguity is so intense that the mind would rather invent an explanation than accept that there might not be one. This leads to what researchers call cognitive closure, the tendency to seal off thought with the illusion of meaning. But here's the deeper conflict. If our experience of reality is always filtered through these pattern-generating systems, how often are we mistaking invention for perception? How many of our daily beliefs, impressions, memories, even emotions are built on imagined structures? If the mind conjures meaning from noise, how do we know when we're seeing the world as it is, and not just as we need it to be? This is more than a philosophical puzzle. It's a practical problem. In an era where information is weaponized, where deepfakes look real and AI-generated lies travel faster than truth, we're increasingly vulnerable to patterns that don't exist. We hear intent in an offhand remark. We connect unrelated events into narratives. We spot signs in algorithms, coincidences in tragedies, and truths in half-heard rumors. Not because we're irrational, but because the brain demands coherence. And this raises a terrifying possibility. What if the world we think we know, our convictions, our intuitions, our sense of reality itself isn't just shaped by false patterns, but is built on them? What if the mind's greatest strength, its gift for finding order, is also the reason we so often see the world not as it is, but as we believe it must be? We are creatures of pattern, but that may mean that much of what we call real is, in some sense, imagined. There's a name for the moment when you see a face in the grain of wood, or the Virgin Mary in a piece of toast, pareidolia. It's a trick of perception, harmless, even funny. But behind that flicker of recognition is something much more powerful: the brain's unshakable need to find meaning in randomness. It's not just about faces, it's about apophenia, the tendency to perceive connections between unrelated things. A song comes on the radio just as you're thinking of someone. You see the same number 3 times in one day. A coin toss lands heads 5 times in a row. Your mind doesn't let it go. It begins whispering, "This means something," and often we believe it. This instinct can spiral into full-blown delusion. Gamblers cling to imagined streaks, convinced the slot machine is due. Conspiracy theorists piece together disconnected event symbols, dates, hand gestures into elaborate maps of hidden control. Movements like QAnon thrive on pattern-seeking minds, offering comfort through illusion. Nothing is random. Everything connects. Even in the stock market, millions of dollars are moved based on chart patterns that have no statistical grounding, just the appearance of structure. Humans see trends in noise and mistake them for truth. History offers sobering examples. John Nash, the brilliant mathematician portrayed in A Beautiful Mind, saw elegant patterns in the world patterns that led to breakthroughs in game theory and economics. But he also saw patterns that weren't there, secret messages in newspapers, coded conspiracies in the behavior of strangers. His genius and his psychosis emerged from the same neurological gift, the ability to connect the dots, even when the dots were imaginary. This blurring of brilliance and delusion stretches back centuries. Medieval astrologers studied the movement of stars and planets with scientific rigor, then used those celestial patterns to predict plagues, wars, and royal births. They weren't trying to deceive. They genuinely believed the cosmos held a hidden logic, a divine pattern they could decode, and in many ways, we still live in that world. Religion, numerology, superstition, they all operate through pattern recognition. Prayer rituals, lucky numbers, the idea of karma or fate, all rooted in the assumption that life follows a deeper design. The number 23, for instance, has captivated artists and musicians for decades. The 23 enigma suggests that this number appears suspiciously often in nature, history, and pop culture. Is it just coincidence? Or are we imposing a pattern because we want to believe something is guiding us? Psychologists face a difficult question. How do we distinguish beliefs rooted in reality from those born of emotional pattern making? After all, many beliefs don't survive because they're truth, they survive because they're satisfying. They give chaos a structure. They tell us we're special, chosen, protected. We aren't just pattern-seeking animals, we're comfort-seeking animals. And sometimes the comfort is more important than the truth. Evolutionary biology explains why. In our ancestral past, a false positive or type 1 error was often safer than a false negative. If you heard a rustle and assumed it was a tiger when it was only the wind, you lost nothing. But if you assumed it was nothing and it was a tiger, you died. Natural selection favored the paranoid, the ones who over-detected patterns. It made us skittish, suspicious, hyper-aware of coincidences. It made us see things that weren't there and survive because of it. But in the modern world, that survival mechanism can turn against us. The same neural engine that helped early humans find food or shelter is now processing the endless noise of the internet. 24-hour news, and algorithmic suggestion. It sees hidden meaning in headlines, symbolism in images, prophecy in tweets. And the more patterns we believe we've uncovered, the more confident we become. No matter how wrong we are, this leads to a chilling possibility. What if society, science, even spirituality are all structured hallucinations? What if the stories we share, the institutions we trust, the systems we believe in are simply collective patterns we've all agreed to see? Some are useful, some are harmful, but all of them, in the end, are human constructions. We aren't just misled by patterns, we build our reality out of them. And the deeper we go, the harder it becomes to separate the map from the territory, the myth from the mechanism, the hallucination from the world. Here's where everything turns inward. We've followed pattern recognition through illusions, delusions, religion, science, and society, but the most surprising destination is the self. Because perhaps the most elaborate pattern your brain has ever created is you. This isn't just metaphor. Cognitive neuroscience is increasingly revealing that the very sense of self, the continuous I you think you are, isn't a fixed thing, but an ongoing mental construction. Memory, which we often treat as a foundation of identity, is not a reliable archive. It's a story constantly rewritten, reframed, and edited based on context, emotion, and new information. Each time you recall a moment from your past, your brain slightly alters it, subtly reshaping it to fit the current narrative of who you think you are. Memory, in this sense, is less about accuracy and more about coherence. The brain doesn't need the truth. It needs a pattern it can believe in. And what is the self, if not a pattern? A loop of familiar habits, roles, preferences, memories, and internal dialogue. We say, "This is who I am," but that who is a moving target, a story composed of recognizable mental motifs. You are your likes, your fears, your traumas, your name, your social roles, but none of these exist as permanent facts. They persist because they repeat. The brain detects this repetition and treats it as continuity. Over time, the pattern becomes sacred, the illusion of a single, enduring identity. Cutting-edge research supports this idea. Neuroscientists studying predictive processing have found that the brain is less like a camera and more like a guess machine. It doesn't passively record reality, it actively predicts it. Based on past experience, the brain generates expectations about what should happen next. It compares those expectations to incoming sensory data, and if they match, it assumes it was right. If they don't, the brain adjusts, but not always fully. Often, it alters perception to fit the prediction. This loop expects, compare, correct, constant. It's how you make sense of the external world. But it's also how you make sense of yourself. This leads to a radical possibility. Consciousness itself might be a recursive pattern recognition system. A self-observing loop, endlessly updating based on predicted input and remembered output. The voice in your head, the feeling of continuity, the idea that I am me. These may all be the result of predictive patterns, repeating fast enough and consistently enough to create the illusion of stability. So here's the philosophical bombshell. If the self is just a pattern, are we real? Or are we merely the stories our brains tell to keep chaos at bay? We tend to think of hallucinations as deviations from reality. But what if your entire sense of identity is the most persistent hallucination of all? This doesn't mean we're imaginary in the traditional sense. It means we are narrative creatures. We live inside a feedback loop of meaning-making. And the you that wakes up every day is not a fixed entity, but a dynamic, improvisational act held together by neural threads of memory, expectation, and pattern. We've been searching for meaning in the stars, in nature, in numbers, in gods and science. But all along, the deepest and most intimate pattern we've ever clung to is the one we call me. Today, science understands pattern recognition not as a single ability, but as the core operating system of the brain. At the center of this is a theory called predictive coding. The idea that your brain is constantly generating predictions about the world, not just reacting to it. Whether you're walking through a crowded street, reading a sentence, or feeling anxious for no clear reason, your mind is always guessing what comes next. It compares those guesses with incoming sensory information and adjusts accordingly. Most of what you perceive, sights, sounds, even emotions, is filtered through this ongoing loop of expectation versus reality. When the prediction matches what's out there, you barely notice. When it doesn't, your attention flares. This system works astonishingly well. So well, in fact, that it inspired some of the most powerful technologies of our time. Deep learning and artificial intelligence are designed to mimic how the brain detects patterns. Neural networks function by adjusting internal weights based on feedback, much like neurons strengthen or weaken connections based on experience. They don't just memorize data, they learn patterns, generalize from them, and make predictions. From facial recognition to language models to self-driving cars, AI is extending our pattern processing capabilities into new domains, but just like us, these systems are only as good as the data they receive. The same feedback loops that make pattern recognition efficient can also lead to bias. The brain, for example, may associate certain groups or experiences with danger or trust not because those links are rational, but because they were reinforced repeatedly. This is how stereotypes, phobias, and cognitive distortions take root. Machine learning algorithms face similar challenges. Trained on biased data, they replicate biased outputs. Recognizing these flaws isn't a feat. The first step toward correcting them. This understanding of pattern dynamics has opened new frontiers in mental health. In PTSD, for example, the brain becomes locked onto a pattern of threat. Even when the danger is gone, the predictive system keeps expecting it, leading to flashbacks and hypervigilance. Therapeutic approaches like EMDR, trauma-informed CBT, or psychedelic-assisted therapy aim to rewrite those patterns, allowing the brain to update its expectations. On the flip side, creativity often comes from breaking expected patterns. Great art, music, or storytelling plays with structure building something familiar, then subverting it in surprising ways. The brain delights in this tension between what's expected and what's new. One of the most profound applications of this science is in meditation. Practices like mindfulness aren't about shutting off thought. They're about training the mind to observe patterns without automatically reacting to them. When you meditate, you begin to see your thoughts, cravings, fears, and judgments not as truths, but as patterns arising and fading. This mental distancing can reduce suffering and increase clarity. It's a way of stepping outside the loop, if only for a moment, and there is deep hope in this. Because while pattern recognition can mislead us, it's also what enables us to plan, to empathize, to build civilization. It's how we detect sadness in someone's eyes, beauty in a melody, or justice in a complex system. Our ability to recognize, question, and refine patterns is what makes progress possible. In a world saturated with information, knowing how our minds work, where patterns come from, how they evolve, how they deceive, gives us a kind of freedom. We can build better technologies, fairer institutions, more compassionate relationships. The same pattern-seeking brain that built myths and hallucinations can also build ethics, science, and self-awareness. And maybe, by understanding this machinery more clearly, we can finally learn when to trust the pattern and when to step outside it. At some point, we all find ourselves staring into the blur moments when life refuses to make sense. A tragedy strikes without warning. A dream falls apart for no reason. The people we love drift away or vanish entirely. In those moments, our minds scramble for answers. We look for signs, patterns, lessons. We ask why. But sometimes there's no pattern to find. And maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe it's a kind of freedom. The brain will never stop trying to turn the chaos of life into a map. It will draw lines between events, stitch stories into memories, find faces in clouds and meaning in chance. That's what it's built to do. But the most profound kind of intelligence might lie not in forcing patterns to appear, but in recognizing when to let go of them, in learning to be okay with uncertainty, in accepting that not everything has a reason or needs one. Because there are things in life that don't follow logic. Love is rarely linear. Grief doesn't obey time. Beauty defies prediction. And joy can arrive in the most unexpected places. These aren't errors in the system. They're reminders that not everything needs to be explained to be real. Some experiences are too fluid, too deep, too human to ever be reduced to cause and effect. It's a humbling thought that in a universe possibly devoid of inherent structure, we are meaning-making machines, but it's also a beautiful one, because even if the cosmos has no grand design, we still create music, raise children, tell stories, search the stars. We find purpose, not because the pattern is handed to us, but because we choose to see it. And maybe that's the real gift, not that the brain finds patterns, but that it can also learn when to stop searching, to sit with mystery, to feel deeply without explanation, to live inside the questions. So here's the one to leave you with. Asterisk, asterisk. If the mind builds patterns to make sense of life, what happens when we learn to live without needing all the answers?